Well, thank you, everybody. You know, we live in an incredibly health-conscious country. How many of you have ever bought bottled water? Right? When you buy the bottled water, are you concerned that maybe there's some BPA in the plastic? Yes, some of you are. So you're concerned to such an extent about health that you decide to buy something that you can get for free out of your tap, and then you're further concerned about whether or not there's some thing called BPA in the plastic. If you go to the grocery store, there are aisles full of products, supplements that you can take, ranging from willow bark to alpha-lipoic acid to L-carnitine, all of which might be helpful, but sells tremendously well. We even pass laws that are designed to help a minority of people in the country in order to protect their health. What's one such law? A big one is the seatbelt law. We all put on our seatbelts now because we have to, it's the law, and because we know, well, we don't want to go through a windshield. But the reason why the law is there is to make it so that a minority of people don't get injured, right? Because it wouldn't be a majority of us that at some point in our lives go through the windshield. It would be a minority. We all wear our seatbelts in order to protect the minority who would otherwise get hurt. Similarly, motorcycle helmets. If you go anywhere near a ski slope these days, everybody's wearing a helmet. Most people didn't end up with head injuries. All right, so here we are in a country that is focused on health to such an extent that we pass laws to protect the minority. Isn't it odd that we don't seem to mind the 500,000 people a year who die of cigarette smoking related illness? And we don't seem to mind the 80,000 people a year who die of alcohol-related illness. And we don't really seem to mind the 50,000 people a year who die of opioid-related illness, although that is coming out in the media. Why is it opiates are coming out in the media and tobacco and alcohol aren't? Why is it that the drug that kills 50,000 people a year makes headlines, and the drugs that kill 580,000 people a year is nowhere near the front page? Why is that? Well, it's because the majority of people would like to continue to be able to use the two drugs that are responsible for killing 580,000 people a year. Even though those same people are buying bottled water where they're watching out for the BPA that might hurt them. So we live in a country that's health conscious, but that doesn't seem to always make sense. So how can we change the text? How can we make it so that this is clear to people that addiction, no matter what the drug is addiction? How can we clarify that it doesn't matter whether or not your favorite drug is methamphetamine or marijuana or tobacco or heroin? It's all the same. It all boils down to a disease state. And you know what? It's a congenital disorder, a birth defect, if you will, because we're not talking about substance use. We're talking about a disease that affects about 15% of the American public. Well, how does it affect 15% of the American public? Because 85% of the public can drink, can take an opiate, can use marijuana, and can even smoke from time to time and not end up with addictive disease. Heck, when I was 13 or 14 years old, I needed a root canal. The night before the surgery was one of the most painful experiences I care to have, and I got an injection of Demerol, a morphine-like agent. The Demerol essentially made me nauseated. It gave me an uncomfortable feeling, and thank God I fell asleep. There was no joy in it. And yet I talk to my patients, and they tell me about their first experience with a morphine-like agent, and they say, my God, it was better than sex. Right? And so you sit there and you say, why did they have that experience and I didn't? What's the difference there, other than there must have been something separating the two of us before either of us ever used the drug, hence birth defect. This is a congenital disorder. Let me give you another metaphor designed to separate that out. As humans, we fall on what's called a normal curve. I'm going to walk over to the flip chart here. And let's see. That is coming out on the screen. Wonderful. All right. We live on a normal curve. We're distributed normally, meaning that if I were to pull all of you out and measure your IQs, most of you would be right here in the middle. Some of you would be way up here. Some of you might be way down there. But if I take a whole population, what we're going to find is that it is distributed like this. I could do that with height. I could do it with pulse rate. I could do it with body temperature. There is another normal distribution that we find in humanity, that of how aware we are of the world around us. How much does the world around us stimulate us? How loud is it? How irritating is it? How annoying is it? How distressing is it? So let's say that all of us were to walk outside on a bright, sunny day. It's noon. The sun is shining down, and we're in Arizona, where the sun's real bright. How many of you would put on a pair of sunglasses when you walk outside? Show of hands. How many of you would not put on a pair of sunglasses when you walk outside? How many of you are somewhere in the middle, you don't really care one way or the other? We get a bunch. All right. So we saw a pretty good distribution there. A lot of you were, I would put on the sunglasses. Why is it that we would all walk out on an equally sunny day? We're all seeing the same sun. Why is it we perceive it so differently that some of us would use a drug in the form of sunglasses designed to make it more comfortable? Right? And some of us wouldn't. Those of you who would put on the sunglasses, I'm going to call stimulus augmenters, meaning you're taking the stimulus of the sun, and in your brain, the volume knob is turned up a little too high, so that when you put on the sunglasses, you think to yourself, well, that's more comfortable. That's the way it ought to be. Stimulus augmenters, in general, are individuals who find the world too loud, too noisy, too annoying, too irritating. You're the ones who don't like turbulence on airplanes, who don't want to go downhill real fast if they go skiing, who don't go rock climbing or do exciting things like that because the world's already too much. You'd like to turn it down. And you do so, if it's light, by putting on sunglasses. But what's another way that you can turn the world down? Okay. Heroin was offered. What other possibility do we have? Alcohol. Alcohol does the same thing. All right. Over on the other side of the curve, those of you who don't even own a pair of sunglasses, for you folks, you're what we call stimulus reducers. The world is not vivid enough, not noisy enough. What you'd like to do if you could, is make the world noisier. You go to a club where the music's loud and pumping. Or you take a drug that makes the world more vivid. Methamphetamine, there we go. So let me ask you, this is just a metaphor, but I'm going to ask through a shouting of voices whether I've properly identified you simply by whether you wear sunglasses or not as to what drug you prefer. Okay. So the bottom line is that since you likely thought that way before you ever picked up a drug, there was something wrong then, such that the very first time you ever used a psychoactive drug, your response was, oh my God, that's how it's supposed to be. And you know what? You're right. That is the way it's supposed to be. And for 85% or so of the population, because this is the big part of the population, that's the way things are. The folks with addictive disease are outliers. You're the 15%. You're the ones we need to worry about before you ever get the drug. Because you're born with it. That's the difference between substance use and the problems that can arise from substance use and addictive disease or substance use disorders. A disorder or a disease is something that's present without the context of an external drug or agent. It's a disease that comes before the drug. So when we talk about addictive disease, we're not talking about alcohol or heroin or methamphetamine. We're talking about your brains, and we're talking about your brains in the absence of the drug. So when patients come in, and I'm talking to their insurance company on the phone, as I often have to do, and the insurance company says, well, Mr. Smith went through his treatment. He's all done now. I said, what do you mean by that? Well, he was in the residential facility for 28 days. He's clean and sober, so he doesn't have that addiction issue anymore. No, now we're going to start treating the addictive disease. So when we're talking about going into rehab, going through partial programs, going into inpatient detox and so forth, we're not treating addiction. We're treating intoxication. We're treating withdrawal, right? Those are easy. I can give anybody intoxication and withdrawal to the point that they require a hospital. That's not what's being treated there. It's only later, afterward, after the post-acute withdrawal is out of the way, after you start thinking clearly again, and at that point, we can start getting to the core. And the core is that you're uncomfortable. You're uncomfortable to begin with. That discomfort is what needs to be treated to get you to the point where you say, I'm all right in my own skin. So that comes to part two. For part two, because addictive disease is a three-part entity. We have the genetic part, which we just went through, the part that you're born with, the part that you can't get away from, and it's the part that makes it so that life is an uncomfortable place without drugs. All right. Part two is an environmental issue, because there are some folks out there born with the disease of addiction who don't end up with addictive disease. What differentiates them from those with the illness? Well, there's got to be a trigger, like there are for many diseases. See, if I take a patient with juvenile diabetes who happens to have an identical twin, the identical twin doesn't always have juvenile diabetes, even though they have the same genetic structure And the genes are calling for the immune system to attack the islet cells of the pancreas, to make it so that insulin isn't produced and they can't metabolize sugar the way they should. So all of that is built in, and yet one identical twin has it and one doesn't. Why? Because the same thing's true in addictive disease. What is it that makes the difference, that triggers these genes so that you end up having trouble? Well, it all goes back to when you're about 4, 5, 6 years old. Always does. And it more often than not involves a parent. Almost always the parent of the same sex as you are. The difficulty is a lack of ability to identify with that parent, to want to be like that parent, or the parent is not properly representing themselves. They're irresponsible, inconsistent, abusive, hostile, absent. Whatever it is, they're not making the connection. I apologize to those of you who've heard this story before. I've told it before. It's the baseball story. Little boy goes out, very first time he's going to play baseball. He knows it's his first time. His friends know it's his first time playing baseball. Where does he get put? Right field. So there's our 7-year-old. He's standing out in right field. Nothing happens in right field if you're playing with a group of kids. Ball's never going to get out there. And yet, inevitably, one does. Come somewhere in the 8th inning or 9th inning, he's standing there, he's sunburned, he's hungry, he needs to go to the bathroom, he's counted the 4-leaf clovers, he's already decided what the clouds look like, paying no attention whatsoever to the game because it's so bloody far away, and the ball lands behind him. He hears it plop. And everybody's yelling at him. What the heck do I do with this ball? I pick it up. It's too big for my hands, and I have to throw it. Everybody's yelling, but I see some guy running. I'll throw it at the running guy. No, that's wrong, and I don't hear the end of it from my friends. I go home. I say, Dad, I don't know how to play baseball, and everybody made fun of me, and I feel awful. And Dad looks at me, he says, you know what? I think that happens to every boy. It sure as heck happened to me. Let's go grab some ice cream. I'll take you out in the backyard. I'll teach you how to play baseball. You will never have this kind of embarrassment again. Or Dad says, well, Billy, you just suck at everything you do, don't you? How many of you had a dad like that? Right. That's the dad who teaches you something. And what that dad teaches you is, when I feel uncomfortable and when I need to share my emotions with other people so that I feel better, I will end up feeling worse. And if I learn that enough times at the hands of the only person in my life who I'm supposed to be able to trust at that age, then I will grow up thinking, when I am uncomfortable, instead of being part of the herd, because we're a herd animal, right? We don't stand by ourselves, we stand in groups. But I won't have learned that. And I'll end up going through my life thinking to myself, when I'm uncomfortable, the last thing that I'm going to do is go up to somebody and tell them about it. What I'm going to do instead is run from that, because that will make me feel worse, which is why when I look at my patients and I say, listen, I can make it so that you end up getting your life back. You'll be rehired at work. Your family will love you again. Your kids will actually talk to you. You'll have a home. You'll even have a car that runs. And you'll have money in your pocket. What I want you to do is go in front of a group of people, all of whom have had the same experience as you. I want you to stand up in front of that room. I want you to say, hi, my name's Stu, I'm an alcoholic, and share with them the feelings that you've had and the difficulties that you've had and the burdens that you carry, and let them help you. Well, if they jump up and hug me and say, thank you, Doc, I can't wait, I'm going to go to the next AA meeting, I've made a misdiagnosis. That's the scariest thing in the world to this particular group of people, right? Doing what you guys do to come here in groups. This is something, can you imagine yourself doing what you're doing now when you were using? Right? This is scary as heck. Right? So congratulations to you guys for overcoming the hurdle that your parents put there. All right, so that's the bottom line as to the way the environment triggers the disease. You're uncomfortable. You're growing up. You've learned not to share that discomfort with anybody. And then part 3 happens. Part 3 is something that would never happen or would be highly unlikely to happen if we lived in a community that didn't promote drug use. We live in a culture that promotes it. What are you supposed to do the day you turn 21? What are you supposed to do when you go to a football game? What are you supposed to do when you go to a wedding? What do most people do at a funeral? Okay, so the bottom line is our cultural events are all tied to activities in which people use psychoactive drugs. You can't possibly go through life and not be exposed to that. Well, let's look at what a psychoactive drug does. And I'm going to go with alcohol here only because it happens to be one of the more prevalent of the drugs. So alcohol, and by alcohol I don't just mean beer or wine or hard liquor. I am also talking about all the drugs that work the same way in the brain. That includes Valium, Librium, Ativan, Klonopin, Xanax. It includes Lunesta, Ambien, and Sonata. It includes phenobarbital. It includes chloral hydrate. It includes Soma, which is the muscle relaxant that some of you may have been prescribed. All of these drugs, all of the solid ones, are just very dry martinis, okay? They work the same way. They all do the same thing. They cause a 2-hour period of sedation. Now, on this curve, I have the horizontal line that's time. And here on the vertical line, I have a line that represents where you start, mildly sedated or relaxed, very relaxed, asleep, dead. As we go, I think it's the dry way I present that makes the laugh with dead. As we go up, we see somebody who's a little jittery and uncomfortable, extremely agitated, grand mal seizure. All right? So that's our range that we go from and to. When I drink alcohol, I get what I call curve A. It's a 2-hour-long period of sedation or relaxation or sleep, depending on how much I've imbibed. If I drink too much, I fall asleep. Well, that's not what I'm trying to do when I go to a party, so I don't drink that much. So if you're going to drink and experience a certain level of sedation for the duration of the party, you have to know how to drink. You don't start out at home by having an enormous amount and then go to the party and wait for it to gradually wear off. That's not the way it works. You have 1 drink per hour. When you have 1 drink per hour, or 2 drinks per hour, as the case may be, sorry. So as you go through the evening, what you're trying to do is maintain a certain level of sedation. So about here, about when the first amount of alcohol peaks, is when you start your second one, and you go like this. So what you're actually experiencing over several hours of an extended football game is an ongoing level of sedation that doesn't change very much. However, what you don't know is what happens next. The brain works by setting things. It likes to set things in a particular way. So it sets, for instance, your heart rate and your body temperature and so forth. And when alcohol comes along and pushes on the brain like that, the brain says, no, 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 I'm trying to go here. And when the brain does that, it overshoots. It goes like that, right? So as the brain overshoots, it does so in what we call a damped manner. What do I mean by damped? If I had a steel ball here and I dropped it on the floor, it would just suddenly go bang on the floor. But if I had a long tube full of motor oil and dropped the steel bearing into the tube of motor oil, it would slowly drop to the ground, a damped system. The brain works the same way. So when I push on it with the alcohol, the brain pushes back, but slowly and over a longer period. As a result, I get curve B. Curve B is barely noticeable. If you've had enough to drink so that you just notice the alcohol, you won't notice curve B. Curve B is the agitation, the result of having used alcohol hours before. It lasts 6 to 8 hours. If I've had a certain amount of alcohol 4 times in a row over an extended period of time to maintain my level of sedation, you would think, oh, well, then I'll maintain the level of agitation tomorrow. No, because the brain is a damped system. So there's that longer period of agitation. What ends up happening is that each of these curves generates a curve B. So here you are the next morning at about 4 in the morning when you should be sleeping, and instead, that's you. And you say, my God, why am I so hungover? I was never really drunk yesterday. True, but you were intoxicated to some degree over an extended period of time, long enough that you get an agitation that seems to be far stronger than the sedation you had initially. This happens with everybody. 100% of mammals get this kind of curve with any sedative drug, be it Budweiser, Xanax, phenobarb, or Ambien. They all do the same thing. However, there's a difference in terms of how we all perceive this. Take the normal curve that I showed you before of stimulus augmenters and stimulus reducers, and we can draw that right here, and imagine that instead of starting where the average person starts, you start here. And this is your baseline. I need another color. So a person with addictive disease has a baseline that's higher than everybody else, so that when you take alcohol or a sedating drug, you go like that. And you say, I feel normal. I feel the way I'm supposed to feel. I feel the way I think everybody else feels. And then you get the second curve. And if you thought you were uncomfortable to begin with, you ain't seen nothing yet, right? This becomes impossible to cope with. So now here you are at this point that's impossible to cope with. And your parents took away from you the normal coping mechanism, which is, oh my God, I feel terrible. Let me talk to everybody and make sure they know that. Right? And so they can offer me some support. Because you know that if you talk to other people, you'll end up feeling worse. So you have no choice at that point but to turn back to the very drug that caused this to happen in the first place. And when you do that, to counteract the effects of curve B, you will feel better temporarily. But then you'll feel worse again later, even worse than you did. That's what you're chasing. That's what everybody chases, whether they have the disease or not. That's why patients come in to me and tell me that when they've been on Vicodin for 5 years for something that they didn't need Vicodin for in the first place, that they have to take the Vicodin. Because they have to feel better from this horrible feeling that they have, which is simply the withdrawal from the Vicodin. And if I can get them through the withdrawal comfortably, they'll go back to their original baseline, which is much better than the point they're at now. The same thing holds true with the people who've been taking Valium or Xanax or Klonopin for more than 8 weeks. All of them are experiencing more side effects than desirable or beneficial. So when we're talking about this point, and you say to yourself, well, because realize the average person out there is saying, well, these people do this to themselves. Even if they feel that uncomfortable, they don't have to pick up the bottle. Well, imagine that I close the doors to this room, lock everybody in, and I put food up here, and I say, do not eat the food, it's poisonous, it will kill you. But I lock you in. Some time goes by, close to a day before the first person goes up and eats the food. He eats the food and instantly drops dead next to the food. And you'd say to yourself, well, the rest of you, you can see that it kills people. You're not going to eat that food, but you're still here in the room. And I guarantee you that more and more of you will start to go up and eat the food. And you'll say things to yourself, well, it killed him, but I'm a lot stronger than he is. It won't kill me. Yeah, it killed him because he ate it too fast. I'm going to go more slowly. He ate off that side. This side, I think, will be the good one. You'll all eat the food. I guarantee it. There will come a point where, despite the fact that it's proven deadly to you, where you've seen people die from it, you'll eat the food. And darned if this doesn't sound exactly like what's going on with heroin with the fentanyl mixed in, right? Where people go and they eat the food. It's killed their best friend. And they'll say, yeah, all right, it won't do it to me, right? Because that's part of the disease. It's part of the process, right? But it's not because of denial. It's because of human nature. This would happen to 100% of people if they were pushed hard enough in that direction. It's just that we have 15% of the American public that's pushed there. And what we have to realize as a culture, where am I here? Good. What we have to realize as a culture is that if we're going to protect our 15%, the way we do with fluoride in the water, the way we do with BPA-free plastic in our water bottles, the way we do with seatbelt laws, the way we do with motorcycle helmets, is we have to move away from being a culture that embraces the use of psychoactive drugs as a way of entertaining ourselves. And we can't do that when 90% of the country seems to be standing up, embracing marijuana as the second coming, and saying, this should be used because why not? Which seems to be the best argument that they've got. And I'll tell you something, y'all are why not. So what we've got is a culture that embraces psychoactive drugs at the same time as we've got loads and loads of 747s going down with people every day. And you know we would do something about that, right? If there were indeed 4 747s full of people crashing every day, it's something our society would not stand for. And yet we're losing that many people every day due to addictive disease. And we're barely saying something about that. The fact that we are starting to about opioid addiction, great, wonderful. Calls more attention to it. C-SPAN 2's here this year. I think that's fantastic. We're on the air. Thank you. And it's wonderful to think that we're getting a wider audience than usual for this topic, which affects so many in our culture and our population, but we need to stop turning a blind eye to that population. And that means accepting that the 85% who can use from time to time without significant degradation of their life needs to say, you know what, it's not worth it. I'm not going to bother because it hurts too many people. So I'm not a prohibitionist. I wouldn't sit here and say it should be outlawed, it should be thrown out, take it away. But I would sit here and remind us of something, which is if we look back at prohibition of alcohol, which is what we have now for the most part for marijuana. If we go back to the alcohol days, the use of alcohol per capita dropped almost 50% as a result of prohibition. And the amount of disease, the prevalence of alcohol-related disease dropped by almost 2/3 during prohibition. So prohibition may have been a political failure, but it was an enormous public health success. What we have right now with marijuana, on a federal level anyway, is the public health success. If we abolish that and get rid of prohibition as we did with alcohol, we will see the exact same thing happen as happened with alcohol. Increased per capita use of marijuana, followed by increased problems of addiction related to marijuana. Yeah. Now, let me ask this group something, just because we're on the air and broadcast, and I apologize, I'm going to ask you all to raise your hands. How many of you ever used opioids as a recreational drug? All right. Keep your hands up. How many of you started out with a drug other than an opiate, like marijuana? Gee, all the hands are still up. You didn't go in the other direction? Opiates first and then marijuana? No. So you started with marijuana and then moved to opiates. Now, I wouldn't make the argument, you can put your hands down. I wouldn't make the argument that everybody who uses marijuana will move on to opiates. But let me ask you this. Did you know when you first used marijuana that you were going to end up using heroin? No. Thought didn't occur to you at that point, right? You said, no, that'll never be me. Right. So for all of you out there watching on TV saying, that will never be me, you just don't know. It has been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. This is still the favorite place that I come to each year. Thank you so much. My hat is off to you for all that you do, and keep doing it.